and I've got the easiest job of all. All I have to do is ask questions. They have to do all the work. I'm not going to introduce our guests to you because I think you know all of them and their bios are in the packet anyway. I would just say that one thing that leapt out at me as I was thinking about this is the extraordinary versatility of the people before us. We not only have 6 former U.S. trade representatives, we have 1 who served in the U.S. Senate, we have 4 who held other cabinet positions in addition to USTR, and we have all of them who've had distinguished careers as well in the private sector or in academia. So what you're dealing with here, I think, is an extraordinary breadth and depth of experience, not only in trade policy, which is the topic, but also in government and politics. And it's an honor for me to be up on the stage with them, and I think it'll be interesting and I hope enjoyable for all of you to listen to what they have to say. We're going to not do set pieces. I'm going to ask a few questions. They're going to talk. We'll go back and forth. Maybe they'll disagree. Maybe they won't. If they don't, I'll try to say something outrageous so that they do. And then we'll continue. I think we're going to start with the specific and the thing that is most in the trade area, I think, on most of your minds, which is TPP and regional Asia-Pacific trade issues. And then I think as we move on, we'll probably get broader into some other areas as well. So let me pose the first question to the panel, and then we'll just kick this around for a while. And it has a lot of other sort of subsidiary questions that we'll get to. But let's take TPP. Let's begin with that. Are you optimistic? Pessimistic? Is this going to get to the finish line?
I think we start with Schwab, who did this in 2008.
It's all her fault, so
it's
go
all
ahead.
her fault, right.
Wow. Gee, thanks, Mickey. This is, TPP is the ultimate coalition of the willing, right? I mean, this is a group of countries that have gotten together that want to negotiate the trade agreement with the higher bar, right? The highest common denominator trade agreement. That's the theory. Therefore, it should be doable. If this group can't get it done, then one has to wonder whether anything is doable. There are obviously hurdles. What are we dealing with that is different? Obviously, you've got different stages of development that we're dealing with. We're dealing with services, investment, sort of a really comprehensive agreement. When we launched this in September of '08, we knew this was going to be different. We knew this had the potential, and we hoped ultimately this would have the potential to backward integrate or reverse integrate ultimately into a broader plurilateral, multilateral context. The WTO, we knew that the Doha round was in deep kimchi, as it were, in 2008. So one has to be optimistic, and many of you heard me say, and I think my colleagues would agree, that if you are a trade negotiator and you are not optimistic, you would slit your wrists on multiple occasions. So we have to be optimistic.
Other comments?
Can I interrupt? Just to say that, just lest the audience get misled by all this, Mickey introduced Sue not in the spirit of bipartisanship, even though he's a Democrat and she's a Republican. It's because they're in the same law firm. So now
name the law firm, finish the ad, finish the commercial.
I'll let you
Mayor
do
Brown.
that, Sue.
It's Mayor Brown.
Mayor Brown.
Uninitiated.
It's Mayor Brown.
Well, look, I think that or did you want to say
No,
something?
no, go ahead, Charlene. I'll follow.
I was going to say,
Ladies
look,
first.
This is, then Carla should go first. This is a very important agreement. I am optimistic it'll get done. I don't know that it'll get done this year, but it'll get done, I think, in a reasonable time frame. It's important because the Asia-Pacific region is critical to U.S. economic growth. That's obvious. It's critical because the Asia-Pacific region is being pushed and pulled in different directions. The ascendancy of China, the U.S. presence, Japan, whose economy had been in recession for so long, losing its imprimatur in that part of the world, Korea beginning to rise. There are a number of tensions, a number of there's a lot of different thinking about economic policy and economic structure. And so to have an agreement that helps countries converge on a higher, more specific, common set of standards, including in areas not covered by the WTO at all, becomes very important. And it sets a standard for behavior in the region, first and foremost, as well as potentially multilaterally. So I think it's a very important agreement, and I am optimistic.
Let's finish off the women, and then we'll give the men a chance.
Well, I'm optimistic it will be done. I'm not optimistic it will be done this year. Mm-hmm. And I think the risk is, as has been suggested, we want a high-level agreement in a coalition of the willing, and I would add with open architecture so others could join. We may have to bend some of those rules. The United States is already getting a lot of static for our own restrictions. And the question is, do we have the political will to deal with those? Because it could still be a good agreement, but it might not be as high level as the 6 of us would recommend.
Yeah, I think it'll get done too. Now that Japan is in. Had Japan not come in, I think it would have gotten done as well, but I'm not sure it would have gotten through the U.S. Congress because there wasn't much there. There's a lot more there now with Japan coming in, so that gets people excited who were not excited before, and that's important. Now, timing is important too in this context. I don't think there's a prayer, Carla, that it'll get done this year. No. And I don't think they'd have gotten it done this year even if Japan had not come in.
I don't either.
But I think ideally from the U.S. standpoint, Bill, if they could finish it next year, right after the election and present it to the Congress in early 2015, I think that would be ideal. That's not going to be easily done. That's a very tight time schedule.
Is anybody in the we can finish it this year camp?
No, but I think that we ought to see the contradictions. It's a terrific agreement, needs to be done, it will get done. I agree with everyone on the time frame, it won't be done this year. But what does it lead to? What is the next step? How do we deal with China and Korea and Taiwan and others? How do we really pull the Asia-Pacific together? What does that mean in terms of standards? Are we going to have to compromise? I think so, in terms of certain standards. And I think it's well worth doing if we have an idea where we're going after and how we're going to absorb China and Korea and others and bring them. Look, we've got a problem in Asia right now, I believe, brewing. We've got the ASEAN +3. We have China, Japan, Korea coming together with an agreement. We have this spaghetti bowl of trade agreements out there. We're going to have to deal with that at some point. This gives us a chance. It's a platform. It's really a terrific step forward. But as Carla suggests, open architecture. We ought to be thinking what's next and how are we going to deal with it.
I don't worry so much about the high standards. I think we can do that. I think we can pull the group along. What I worry about is our own restrictions. Will we insist on exempting sugar? Will we fuss over dairy? Will our agricultural supports be maintained? Are we willing to take a broad view and say, for the U.S. economy and for the good of the group, we need to move ahead? And if we could get a services agreement and put it in this agreement, it would add tremendously to global GDP and the U.S. GDP and create jobs, because that's where our jobs and our economics are for the future.
Could I add to that? Oh, no,
Please.
You go ahead, Bill. No.
Just 2 quick thoughts. If you're going to worry about what comes next, forget it. Nothing's going to come next if we don't do this. This is going to set a pattern. It's going to set a series of commitments. And it is possible that you could have an agreement. I agree with Carla. You may have to make some compromises. But you had better start moving. This country does not have a trade policy. It very much needs it. The world desperately needs it. And I guess the question is, can we do it in the next 12 months? Because if you don't do it in the next 12 months, you're not going to do it next year. And that puts you off till early 2015, and you got the same rubric, except you got a different election coming up. The test of whether we can pass it in the next year, 12 months, is whether or not we can get fast-tracked. If we don't get fast-tracked, forget it. You've already got very serious problems on one party side with enough people to stop an agreement without, or to destroy it effectively. If you can't get that, and the president is going to have to lead or take a walk. If he doesn't lead, nothing else is going to happen.
I agree absolutely with Bill, and I'm a little concerned about this, well, we can't do it this year stuff. It's doable. We could get it done this year.
That's right.
And we could get it done this year, and if not by December, you could get it done in January. I mean, the entire Korea deal was done in 11 months. So if you've got, and granted, you've got 12 participants here. I mean, granted, this is complicated. I get that. Granted, you've got Japan, and Japan is sometimes hard to bring along, but they've got a new, they've got a different structure for making decisions and for negotiating, and hopefully it will be less cumbersome than some of the structures that Japan has fielded in the past for negotiations. But the fact is, if you don't say, we've got to get it done this year, then it ain't going to get done this year.
Right.
So the pacing item is fast track, it seems to me. Mm-hmm. And one could argue, respectfully, that the administration's a little bit over the tips of their skis on this one relative to fast track. So
I don't know what that means.
It means that they're a little ahead of themselves in terms of the negotiation relative to where their implementing authority is. It's not fatal, but they need to get fast track on the books so they can get the deal closed. But the negotiators are making progress, yeah, and they can close this deal by the end of this year. If the leaders say to the ministers, it's time to get this done, you know what? They can get it done. But it's very hard to do. It's very hard to imagine in the absence of fast track.
I couldn't agree more. I think that the Trade Promotion Authority is absolutely essential. And I'm not sure the administration believes it is as essential as some of us do. And the reason I say it is essential is that if you don't have it, the toughest issues that we are discussing with our colleagues around the table, they will have much more political difficulty to resolving them without fast track. The other thing that people don't talk about is that the prospects of what we will get out of TPP are large. The prospect is, if Congress could believe that the prospects are large, they are more apt to give the president trade promotion authority. But if you finish the negotiation and you have all the special interests trying to gnaw away at it, it's harder to get trade promotion authority. But now is the window.
Yeah. Let me just add a bit of news. As we're speaking, the Democratic and Republican staff of Ways and Means are meeting to negotiate a TPA, a Trade Promotion Authority bill. That's good news.
That's good
news.
That
they're actually getting together. Go ahead. I'm sorry, Bill.
The only thing I was going to say was that all of these agreements and fast track require presidential leadership.
That's right.
Fast track will not happen without presidential leadership. TPP won't. The US-EU deal won't happen. None of these deals will happen without presidential leadership. That's a lesson all of us learned,
Amen.
All of us faced, all of us had to deal with. And so the administration really needs to declare itself and make clear what its priorities are. There are 4 enormous deals that are on the table. Right. So there's TPP, US-EU FTA, potentially a multilateral services agreement in the WTO, where services in TPP will be extremely helpful and set a standard, and the ITA, Information Technology Agreement, which is being vastly expanded to cover new technologies. The first two need fast track, arguably. The other two don't, not at this point. But each of these agreements is of inordinate benefit to the U.S. If you could think of the largest beneficiary of any of these agreements, it is the U.S. And so the administration needs to make clear that these agreements are the administration's priorities and that the administration will fight for them.
Well, let's pursue one piece of this. This is some very good material. First, the second commercial of the event. A group of associations led by the Business Roundtable, including the National Foreign Trade Council, end of the first part of the commercial, today have rolled out Trade Benefits America, which is a coalition to support enactment of Trade Promotion Authority. So the business community effort on this is going forward. The question I want to ask you related to this, though, and this is something that I think several of you alluded to, I think the argument about timing has been, is it better to do fast-track Trade Promotion Authority right away, or is it better, or is it more likely to be done quickly and smoothly if there is a concluded or nearly concluded TPP agreement out there as the reward, which would argue for waiting 6 months?
Well, would you, if you were in Japan, really want to put rice on the table and take the political heat if you thought that the Congress was not going to vote it up or down? If you were in, you think of all the sensitive topics that our trade partners are facing. What you give them with TPP is, or with Trade Promotion Authority, is the assurance that there will be no amendments and it will be voted up and down. And I think it's absolutely critical.
If you look at the Congress today, I know it's scary. The truth is that if the president, we're all saying the same thing. If the president does not say, we're going to have fast track as a component of this, and it is fundamentally important to have it if we're going to bring this to the Congress, people are going to game this thing. You know the political talent in this town. We'll find a way to mess it up. And you have simply got to have the president, at least the president, saying, this is going to be the sine qua non of getting an agreement. We know we can't do it without that. If we do it, I'm going to put my chips on the table. Then you're going to get the Japanese and others to put their chips on the table. If you don't, again, we keep talking about this as if it were a new issue, that we've been living this game for decades. You've got to have fast track if you're going to get a responsible agreement.
Well, let me push you a little bit more then on timing, because I think everyone agrees with what you just said, and I think everyone would say you want to do fast track first so you can then consider the agreements under those procedures. So I guess the two questions are, how long is it going to take to do fast track? Let's assume we start tomorrow. How long is it going to take to do that? And then you have to build the TPP process out beyond that. So at what point does something actually happen?
Well, you can walk and chew gum at the same time.
Thank you.
Exactly.
You're going to have to
Most of the time.
The Congress can do that, you think?
Well, no, but they can be persuaded to do it, and they can have their priorities set by a president and an administration that makes us high on their agenda, very high on the agenda. Right now, I don't know where it is on the agenda. Others here may know more than I'm sure know more than I do about that. It should be high on the agenda. It has to be. Everybody said this. I don't want to say it again, but you've got to, at the same time, pursue TPP negotiations. You can't just stop negotiating when you're pursuing, as everyone knows, a Trade Promotion Authority. So you ought to do both at the same time. I believe it's easier to get TPA through the Congress, fast track, when you don't have a lot of agreements on the table. Right. So you got a bunch of people in Congress who don't like one or the other, and suddenly you have a unholy alliance against Trade Promotion Authority because they don't like what's on the table from the negotiations.
I agree.
You're absolutely right.
That's the crux of the issue.
Let me just don't forget the asset we've got. We've got two committees in Congress, and they are the responsible committees that like this. They understand the need for fast track, to use the euphemism. They understand the need for TPP. Both committees will support it, as it is, as both would be presented today. You can grab that opportunity, but the committees are not doing the negotiating, Bill. That's the administration's job. The committees can do the fast track at the same time, and they have to.
You know, we renewed fast track when we were negotiating the North American Free Trade Agreement.
Right.
You negotiate, and you can talk to Congress. But believe me, it's going to be easier to get fast track if you talk about the benefits that you're going to get from the agreement, the grand design, rather than to have the little nitty-gritty trade-offs that have to take place in any negotiation.
Clayton, you were going to say something?
Well, I don't disagree with that. I think the sooner we get fast track, the better. I wish fast track were permanent rather than transitory, and we all agree with that. But that's probably that's way up in the clouds.
Not going to happen.
No,
Just keep going.
It's not going to happen. So the sooner the better, and I think with strong leadership from the president and a new USTR who is going to have a lot of clout on Capitol Hill and be highly respected over there, I think that helps as well. So it seemed to me this is a good time in the relatively near future to have that happen. And I think it's good to have an objective to finish these agreements as soon as possible, but I think you also have to be realistic with TPP. The Japanese, although they're going to hit the ground running, they're not going to hit the ground at all until at least July and maybe later. And then you've got a lot of tough issues you have to deal with in TPP.
Let's turn to that last point for a minute. We've talked about timing, and several of you have referred to Japan and the entrance of Japan into the TPP. And I guess I'd put two questions to you at the same time. One, some of you have already answered the first one, which is that going to does that make finishing this harder or easier?
Yes.
Okay. Well, why don't you elaborate on that before we get to the other part of the question?
Oh, okay. Yes. I mean, the
harder and easier.
Harder and easier. It is tough negotiating with the Japanese. They go through this. First of all, they've got a lot of sensitivities. I don't need to articulate them. They go through this excruciating process to come up with a position. It can drive you stark staring bonkers if you're in the negotiation. I think all of us have negotiated with the Japanese. But they have set up a cabinet level negotiating apparatus to do this deal, which should help facilitate.
Right.
They have a leader who seems to be capable of making decisions, which is a
good development.
A good development, one we haven't seen for a while. And boy, they really need this deal. And I mean, for their economy. So I think a lot of them recognize it. Now, is this enough to bring it to a close? We'll see. And there'll be a temptation among some of the other countries as you go forward. When somebody doesn't like something, they can stand behind, sort of hide behind a slow Japanese, if the Japanese are slow. On the other hand, the Japanese have a lot of things they want out of this too. I think the Japanese are particularly interested, and here we start getting into some of the sensitivities on our side. They're particularly anxious since the Chorus FTA was negotiated, Korea-US deal that has put them at something of a disadvantage in terms of their access to the US market. This is part of their initiative, their arrows, Abenomics, whatever you want to call it. And so they've got some motivation. They want to get this done. Yes and no. It's easier and harder, and it's faster and slower. And I think the key is that every time they look as though they are slowing down the train, they need to be reminded that they can get off the train at any time. That they look like they're slowing it down and jeopardizing it for the rest of us. And then I think they'll stay with it because they want the deal and they need the deal, and we want them to be part of the deal.
Yes.
And you agree with Clayton that it will be better and easier in the Congress if they're in because there's more to it.
I think it's better and it's easier and it's harder. I mean, it brings constituencies, you know, you bring constituencies on both sides. You have, it's a real market. I mean, you've got a lot of interest on the U.S. export side. If, in fact, this is a big if, we get real market access in the Japanese market, and that means the non-tariff barriers, access that is meaningful. My first job was as a very low-level ag negotiator at USTR trying to get beef into the Japanese market. 30 years later, I was USTR trying to get beef into the Japanese market.
Yeah, but I thought you were talking about the Japanese, not Clayton.
So I mean, it has to be meaningful. It has to be meaningful access. But yes, there's a whole lot of potential there. So that's one that builds a constituency. But then you have these. It also creates issues associated with currency. You know, currency wars and currency manipulation. We know there are sensitivities in terms of the auto sector. On the U.S. side, that's already come out. We know there are sensitivities in terms of rice and so on and so forth on the Japanese side. But that's all in a day's work, right, for a trade negotiator.
Just a little detail in that. I'm sorry, just a little detail. When you are trying to get the White House to make a priority of what you're doing, if it's too small, it's hard to make that argument. With Japan in it, makes it big enough where it's meaningful to the U.S. economy and you can engage a president in what you're trying to do. And so therefore, even though it's more difficult, I agree with you, even though it may go slower, I was 6'4" when I met the Japanese. It's a major headache. On the other hand, they have every right to be as tough as they are and to have their own interests. We just have to fight our way through it. But I want them in because it makes it more meaningful. It means the administration will pay more attention to it. Right.
Yeah, I would just add on the...
Go ahead. Go ahead, Charlene.
Charlene, you go first. Then we'll Clayton.
I would just add on the Japanese side. First, that the thing to watch for is the Japanese bureaucracy. Abe has to be much more successful than any other prime minister in the last 30 years because the bureaucracy outweighs every one of them. And even Koizumi, who was very popular, had dreadful problems with the bureaucrats, including with respect to trade negotiations. So a real test of Abe and of the structure he has set up is whether in fact that structure can withstand exceptionally regressive and conservative tendencies of Japanese bureaucrats who wield extraordinary power in Japan, quite different actually from bureaucrats here, though they think they have that power, or in Europe or most major economies. And whether or not that'll succeed from the Japanese point of view, I think has yet to be demonstrated. It's a positive development. We had similar developments like that in the 90s when Bill Clinton was president. And it was excruciatingly difficult to negotiate agreements with the Japanese. So hopefully this new structure, hopefully Abe's profile, and the fact that they're just beginning to emerge from recession might all galvanize Japan to move forward and proceed apace. But they have to show that they can. And if they can't, then the rest of the TPP countries need to leave them behind.
Clayton?
I would second what Mickey said, that having it be a bigger deal is really important in this context. But to comment a little on Charlene's point, I think the Japanese bureaucracy, Charlene, may be much more supportive this time around.
I do too.
I get that impression because they've had a stagnant economy they've been all dealing with for the last 20 years. And I don't think they want to do that anymore. And I just think the attitude within Japan is much different, and I think the leadership that Prime Minister Abe is providing is really exemplary so far. But the other point I wanted to make, Bill, before we leave this subject entirely, is that additionally, my point was that with Japan in, you get the American agricultural community enthused about this. And it's very difficult, as you well know, to get a trade agreement through the Congress without the help of American agriculture. They weren't against it when Japan was out. They were just disinterested. They had better things to do. Now they're interested.
Can I add just one thing? Because this is a very, I mean, apologies, this is a very obviously U.S.-centric conversation we're having here. But, I mean, you know, you got the U.S. formers. But there's another element that Japan coming into the picture that we shouldn't forget, which is for all of the other participants, this is opening up the Japanese market for all of the other countries involved in this, which makes it a much more interesting proposition for them too, because we're leveraging the U.S. market for all of these other countries to have access to Japan's market in a way that they could probably never get access to Japan's market on their own. So it makes it potentially more interesting, I mean, it makes it more interesting for them as well, and perhaps that will be reflected in them being more enthusiastic about getting to yes faster.
This is a big deal.
Big deal.
Right.
It really is.
I want to come back to ag, but first I want to ask you about some other countries. But first, even before that, I have to announce that we are going to take some questions from Twitter. So go ahead and tweet. Quietly, please. Whom you tweet to, I have no idea, but Maroney can tell you who, what the address is. And somebody at some point is going to hand me your Twitter questions, and then we'll see what we got. Having done Japan, let me turn to other countries. You've got some that have expressed interest: Colombia, Costa Rica, Thailand. Some that are clearly have said they're thinking about it. The Philippines. I think there's some signs that there's at least some people in Indonesia that are thinking about it. There's been discussions with the Koreans about it. Should we be focusing on more countries? Should we be trying to make it bigger at this point? The hint that I read in the media suggested that the president at least had told the Costa Ricans, maybe not right now, but maybe later. What do you all think? Mickey,
My own view is to focus on the Asia-Pacific region. If Thailand wants to come in, if they do, the Philippines will most assuredly come in. Then you just have Indonesia outstanding as the last major economy. That puts a lot of pressure on Indonesia to join in. That's 180 million people, by the way. And that would be exceptionally important. The implication of that is also then that you have, in effect, ultimately a U.S. free trade agreement with the ASEAN countries as a whole, except for except for the three poorest, Laos, Cambodia, and Myanmar, which in any event have to be handled somewhat differently. Their economies are quite far behind the others. But you'd have all the rest of ASEAN in. And I would focus on that before I focused on countries from other regions. I'm not adverse to adding as many countries as possible, but I would not, I would not make a bold statement, no other countries, when Thailand finally expresses interest. I would not do that.
Mickey?
Yeah, I like what Carla said about open architecture. If this administration is not quietly and without fanfare, without publicity, talking to China about this, they're making a big mistake.
I agree.
We have got to deal with the duopoly, China and the United States. It's in our security as well as our political, as well as our economic interests, and China's as well. Because we have got to look at what's going to happen if we have all this proliferation of agreements and we don't come together. Now, you shouldn't do it publicly. You don't have to. You should start having these conversations and see where it doesn't have to slow up anything that you're doing. But if you can convince China this is in their interest, and the U.S. that it's in our interest to bring China in, you have then done something of enormous importance. And I've got to say, negotiating something big is just as difficult as negotiating something small. You spend just as much time on little agreements as you do big agreements. So my view is you start talking to China right now and try to determine what it would take to bring them in the future.
I agree with that. I think that we should talk to China about how we can expand our trade relationship. And I think it would be a good diplomatic move in any event. Indonesia, Thailand, and the Philippines have more or less indicated that they would like to join this. I think that they should be encouraged to join. I think to get ASEAN in, I agree that that is highly important. And then China is negotiating, I think, a lower quality agreement with the ASEANs and the so-called ASEAN +6, the so-called Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. There's a tremendous overlap between the group that we're negotiating with and the group that China's negotiating with. And it would be quite possible with open architecture to have a bridge between the two, which would accomplish what our initial objective was so many years ago, to have a strong Asia-Pacific economic cooperation, an APEC agreement. So yes, I agree with Mickey. And to talk about wanting China in has a very important diplomatic feature to it. China looks at what we're doing and thinks we're trying to exclude it. I think it's a very bad image to change. But if you say we want to negotiate a free trade agreement, and then they say, well, we're not up to doing this standard, you can continue to talk about how you would gradually open some arrangements with China that could be quite positive for our economy.
Other comments on China, Clayton?
Well, not just on China alone. It seems to me that at some point, I think you have to do this by tranches. At some point in time, you've got to cut off this first big, group, or we're going to be negotiating until 2020 if we add a zillion countries. I can see possibly adding Korea in the first tranche if they really want to come in, but that's, it seemed to me as a practical matter, it's going to stop there. But there's no reason why you can't then have a second tranche that would come along pretty soon thereafter and add a number of additional countries that have been mentioned here, and even potentially adding China. You have to just set that up properly so that, you know, that it fits timing-wise and it fits subject matter-wise. And I think that can be done through skillful negotiations. But I think it would be a mistake to add a whole bunch of additional countries in this first tranche.
I'm really cautious about moving to some of the initiatives that have been discussed. We're not even beginning to get serious about China right now. We're not even sure how. And if you want to have, and I would love to see us have, some conversations with China about working with China over the period of time, that's very different from using China as a possible participant here. You got a prospect of doing something big and important and possibly quick. That can set a grounding on which you start building a larger structure. But it's going to take a whole lot more conversation on China with everything that is way beyond anything this group can talk about, cyber and stuff like that. To get to that conversation is going to break you up. You're not going to be able to do that at the same time you're doing this. And I guess I'm even cautious about adding anybody else at this time. You got something on the plate. Let's run like the Dickens and see if it's humanly possible to get it done in the next 12 months. If you can't, maybe you got to open it up. But first things first. You got to have something positive happening in trade. If you do, you're going to get some excitement. Then your business group, Bill, is going to have an enormous impact. But they got to have something to sell. And that's something that's on the table now. And if we grab it, we can lay a foundation for a whole lot more in the future. But you cannot, and this is what I think has been said in a backward way, you cannot let China think that this is defensive. In terms of this agreement, I don't even put China in my own head. This is good enough in its own to move forward. If we start treating it from our attitude as a defense against China, we're making a horrible mistake. That's two different issues. Keep them separate, and then you can move forward once you make the first success.
So,
Talking about open architecture, though, and saying that they would be welcome in is not to bring them in now.
Okay.
But I do think that talking about keeping it open is very, very important.
Okay.
Also, I think that the Philippines and Thailand that want to come in probably could come in very, very rapidly. And I would not make them wait for the second tranche. I would let them come in. Indonesia is the largest economy out there, but it is not as developed as either as the other participants, such as Thailand or the Philippines in many respects. And that one might be more difficult. So that might be. And they're not knocking at the door so loudly. No. The only ones that have really said, I want to join, are the Philippines and Thailand. And I think we haven't even got consensus that Japan is in. The United States has said, yes, we do not have any bilateral reason to object. But it hasn't been voted on. The consensus has not been reached and won't be reached until summer. And so these things can have an evolution.
Yeah, I would make it. Oh, go ahead.
Sue's been waiting.
No, I agree with. I tend to agree with Clayton and Bill that you're either serious about your time frame and getting this done, and you have a means for other countries to join, or you really risk this morphing into a never-ending exercise that is never-ending.
WTO.
Well, exactly. Well, which gets me actually to the point about China, which is where I really, and you may not want to get into a discussion about China at this point, but where we really need to be having the conversation with China is at the WTO, and I think we need to be talking about the multilateral system, because this is the TPP was, first of all, never designed to exclude China. There were offensive and defensive reasons for launching TPP, for the U.S. to become a part of this exercise. Those exist to this day, but it is not to the exclusion of a strong multilateral or reinvigorated multilateral trading system. And there is an opportunity where the Chinese and the United States need to be working together to make a multilateral trading system work better than it is working today.
Yeah, let me just say, with respect to the addition of countries to TPP, it's not as though the U.S. hasn't been working with the Philippines all along. It's not as though the U.S. hasn't been working with Thailand all along. The only country that the U.S. has had difficulty in dealing with has been Indonesia, which is unfortunate. But to the extent substantive progress has been made in keeping with TPP on this informal basis between the U.S. and the Philippines and U.S. and Thailand, I don't see any basis, if they want to say yes, for us to say no. That would be one point. Second, on the China question, first of all, the administration has been discussing many of these issues with the Chinese. China has shown no inclination on its own part to have the U.S. in any of the agreements to which it's a party. And one could argue that China has tried to keep the U.S. out of the ASEAN+3, ASEAN+6 forums, and indeed tried to keep out Australia and New Zealand for the same reasons, which is to say an Asia for Asian agreement, not a Western add-in to the agreement. So the way I look at China is the way China looks at us, extremely pragmatically. And that is that we have interests in Asia that we have had since World War II, during World War II, pre-World War II. Those interests aren't going to go away. They are both commercial interests, political, diplomatic, strategic, military. None of that is going to change. China, now that it is reemerging, also obviously has strategic interests, commercial, political, diplomatic, military, in Asia. That will only intensify over time. That's not going to change. And at the present time, those interests actually don't entirely coincide. We can talk about why they don't entirely coincide, but they don't actually entirely coincide. I think we all know that. So the question is, how do you bridge those divides, as Carla was saying? Where's the bridge? And so this open architecture is one bridge. And that's a different construct than what China has in its agreements, which tend not to be open architecture. So this open architecture, I think, is a very important bridge and a statement by the U.S. to China and to other nations that we'd like to bring you on along. And it's very important, I think, for the U.S. and China, in fact, to get along and stop some of the shadow boxing that's going on in Asia between the two countries. But I think for right now, the U.S. is positioned on TPP relative to China about where you'd expect and about right. And China, for its part, is positioned in ASEAN 3, ASEAN 6, consistent with China's interests, and for China, about right. And that's where it is.
Well, we do have an opportunity because of the overlap of participants in each of these negotiating groups.
Right.
And we should talk about wanting to have bridges.
Yep,
we have open
absolutely.
architecture. Even China has explored that notion. We have a similarity of parties, and we should try to do as much as we can to reduce the hostility where China thinks that we're seeking to contain it, keep it out. We think that they're trying to exclude us, have us not pivot back. And it doesn't help the global economy nor our own national interest to provide any kind of fuel to these misconceptions. Right. We want to reduce them, in my view.
Bill, can I add a kind of a related point? Going a little bit beyond China. I like the TPP negotiating framework or structure, and Carla's been talking about open architecture. And it seems to me one of the benefits of this, if we proceed successfully, is that you can have kind of a bolt-on strategy in the future. To me, I look at it as sort of a two-tiered negotiation with market access down here and all this open architecture up here. And we don't know yet, Carla, just how many of the issues are going to be included up here, but there's going to be a pretty nice batch to which I think we can legitimately expect any new country to agree to. And I think our TPP negotiating partners would agree with that. Mm-hmm. So then if you have people coming, or countries coming along later, you can fundamentally say to them, I think, no matter what the country is, we expect you to agree to the architecture that's up here. We're not going to renegotiate this with you. We expect you to sign on. That then limits the negotiation basically to market access, which makes it a whole lot simpler. And it seems to me that might be a modus operandi to bolt on additional countries in the future.
You've all focused on ASEAN countries, which makes perfect sense. But we've got, as I said in the question, we've got Colombia expressing interest, we've got Costa Rica, Mexico and Canada just joined, Chile is in, Peru is in. Do we have any interest in this side of the Pacific? CAFTA countries? Yes, no?
Well, absolutely, yeah. We have an interest. And Mexico has negotiated a Pacific alliance with Peru, Chile, and Colombia. I don't know why Canada and the United States. Canada has been an observer in those agreements, doesn't join. It's anything we can do to make the Western Hemisphere more competitive is in our national interest, and this would be a very easy step to take.
We have the first tweet. TPP began with New Zealand. What can New Zealand do to help bring it to a successful conclusion?
I take it that wasn't from an Australian.
I guess besides surrender on dairy, what can they do? What can they do to bring it to a successful conclusion?
What more
We're not going to let that happen.
Suggestions, anybody?
Intellectual property.
I'm glad you brought that up, because one of the things I wanted to turn back to was some of the issues, because when Clayton got into this a while back and mentioned a string of difficult issues, all of which were agriculture, which is not to say they're not difficult, but there they are, and dairy, sugar, and some of the others that you mentioned. Are there other issues that are important? Are there other issues where New Zealand is particularly relevant? You want to elaborate?
No. I mean, they're just, we're not going to get, we are all smart enough to know that we are not the trade negotiators. So I'm not going to pretend to Barbara Weissel can look after herself and her team, and I would endorse her against any negotiator anywhere in the world. So, but obviously intellectual property, and you know who you are out there. This has been an issue with New Zealand.
I'm not sure they do, but okay.
Well, anyway, intellectual property, then there are some pharma issues. But there are also, you know, not just with New Zealand, but obviously some issues that are being wrestled with, having to do with, you know, treatment of state-owned enterprises, state-supported enterprises, issues of mutual interest, but just sort of the new issues related to investment, issues. I mean, there are a whole variety of issues, market access, but also the new rules issues. I mean, the folks in this room know this list.
And the services
data
chapter
issues, the services
will be
chapter.
very complex.
Services, payments. Yeah.
Okay.
Which are the American issues that you're having difficulties with? But we're hearing more about the Chinese and the Japanese.
Yes.
What are the American problems?
Anybody want to take a crack at that?
We've got market
the Prime
access.
Minister,
We've got
Prime Minister
market.
thinks we have some sacred cows too, huh? How about that?
We obviously,
Okay.
as you know, sir, we have some couple market access sensitivities, both in goods and services.
And agriculture.
Agriculture is
Well, goods I include goods include
And
agriculture.
textiles and apparel. And
Yes. Yeah.
we've got lots of special interests.
Well, you know, the two leading ones, obviously, that would be of interest to many of these countries on the agricultural side are sugar and dairy,
Yes.
and
And our subsidies.
Those will be very difficult issues for the U.S. And
Maritime.
Yes,
maritime
Jones Act.
always, yes.
And I just note for the audience, this is this week, in fact, beginning in 15 minutes, actually, the Senate's going to start debating the Farm Bill, and both the issues Clayton mentioned are going to be at issue there. There will likely be a sugar amendment, and there may very well be dairy amendments. So,
Reduce or increase support?
I think in the case of sugar, to reduce. In the case of dairy, I don't think anyone's shown their hand yet.
Yeah, it's more
We'll see.
complicated.
Yeah. Let's broaden the discussion a little bit. We've got about, I want to leave a couple minutes for additional questions from the audience, but we've been talking about a regional arrangement, and there, as several of you noted, there's more than one going on. There are multiple regional negotiations in Asia. There's also the US-EU negotiation, which several of you alluded to. Are these substitutes, or are not necessarily desirable, are these becoming the new thing? Are these substitutes for a multilateral approach? Have we run out of gas at the WTO and this is all we've got? Or is this a better alternative? Is this what we should be doing?
We should be doing it, but not exclusively. I think that a platinum level quality regional agreement can be a catalyst to moving the multilateral agenda forward. That happened in history. The Uruguay round collapsed in Brussels in 1990. We started negotiating the North American Free Trade Agreement in 91. It was signed 14 months later, and within 4 months, the parties were back at the table at the Uruguay round, and there was a great spurt for liberalization both in the Western Hemisphere and with the Bulgar goals in Asia. So I think a really fine agreement done in Asia or with Europe. I happen to believe that the agreement with Europe ought not to be an US-EU agreement, but ought to be a Canada-US-Mexico, in other words, a North American European Union agreement, so that we don't have 3 separate free trade agreements with Europe, which only add to the spaghetti bowl and lots of costs and headaches for our entrepreneurs.
Anybody else want to?
Go ahead, Bill.
No, I agree. I think the value of these agreements is that they create a sense that more can be done, and they put pressure on the other countries to be less obdurate in terms of the larger agreement. The problem you're going to have with the WTO is that the world is changing so fast that you're not sure the WTO is competent to cover a lot of the new issues. That's a different issue. But in terms of the substance of the issues we worry about now, you can't move the process forward with all the reluctance there is until we begin to say there are some alternatives, and if you do them, those of you that aren't part of it are going to get lost. And if you say, okay, we'll do this to set a new model, get more excitement, then it's making a contribution to a solution.
It's really, it's right. It's standards and momentum, and they do make a difference. There's no doubt, and we have to go in that direction. Look, first of all, we got to say, first and foremost, Doha is dead. We ought to quit wasting our time even talking about it and start looking at sectoral agreements in Geneva. We can get some done there in financial services and telecom, get the ITA done, get a better services agreement, do that. Agriculture, Clayton, we can take a look at it.
Environment.
Quit messing around with Doha. Yeah. Why in the world anybody would waste another 30 seconds on it, and I'm going to shut up, is beyond my comprehension.
I think that the important aspect, or do you want to go ahead, Sue? You go
well,
ahead.
I would say the trade facilitation deal that they are still trying desperately to get done for the Bali ministerial in December is most assuredly worth doing. But doing pieces of what would have been Doha is worth the effort. Environmental goods is another example of a sectoral deal. But there is no substitute for a healthy multilateral system and a healthy WTO that is not just a venue for adjudicating disputes on the basis of rules that haven't been updated since 1994. And there is absolutely no substitute for it. And so the benefit of these regional deals that are being negotiated is, one, you have precedents that you are negotiating with countries that ideally you can migrate into multilateral agreements later on or as you go along. So that's one benefit. The second benefit is you are building new coalitions of countries that will come to the WTO, ideally supportive of more ambitious outcomes. I mean, our strongest allies during the Doha round for an ambitious outcome to the Doha round were our FTA partners. Even though it meant technically preference erosion for our FTA partners, they were developed and developing countries alike, the most enthusiastic about a high bar, highest common denominator Doha outcome. So those are the two benefits. The downside is that you have constituencies that decide they actually sort of like, and this is the business community I'm talking about here, that it's easier to get these bilateral and regional things done. The multilateral deals just take too damn long, and let's not wait around for it. And one has to have some sympathy. I mean, who wants to, you can't do business on the basis of a deal that takes 10 years to get done. So the WTO and Roberto Azevedo as the new DG is going to have to figure out how to get things done closer to the pace of business. And it means that countries like India, to name names, and others who are obstructing even minor progress today in Geneva toward, for example, trade facilitation, that would be in the interest of developing countries, as much, if not more than developed countries, are going to need to, get religion to see that this is in everybody's interest.
Charlene, then Carla.
Yeah, look, the WTO, and I've been saying this for 20 years, 15 years, has to move to sectoral agreements.
That's right.
Why? Number one, there are too many people and too many countries in the WTO to get an agreement done in a timely fashion.
That's right.
Number two, there are too many countries in the WTO to get an agreement done that is a good agreement and one that's meaningful to business with respect to market access, including movement of capital. Number three, the fewer the number of countries that are committed to doing a sectoral, the more timely the agreement. Business cares about timeliness. So when you look at the Doha round and the agenda, it feels like the agenda of the Uruguay round. It's old. It's old. It isn't where business is. It isn't what business needs now. So you move along the ability of business to do business globally and of increasing the odds of global GDP growth by doing sectoral agreements that have a key characteristic, and two key characteristics. One is other countries can join in even if they're not in the first round. And second and most important, the sectoral agreement in its initial incarnation needs to represent the vast proportion of trade in that sector. In most sectors, maybe 20 countries matter. Maybe. In some sectors, 12 matter. So if you cover 90% of global trade by negotiating with 20 countries, first of all, who cares if the rest free ride? Doesn't make any difference at all. And number two, you have an agreement that opens the countries that matter most to the flow of trade in goods or services or agriculture. You take that to the WTO, and because no one likes to be outside the club, everyone wants to be in the club, and this is what happened on global telecom and fin services, ITA, countries join in because they don't want to be out and they are afraid of losing investment, which is a very powerful inducement for countries to join into these sectoral agreements over time. So I think that becomes very important. If I had one hope for the Doha round, the hope would only be in tariffs. And the reason is most FTAs globally are glorified tariff agreements. They don't touch agriculture, they rarely touch services. The rules are below base. They're glorified tariff agreements. If you had a WTO tariff agreement that zeroed out as many tariffs as possible, you would erode much of the rationale for the spaghetti bowl free trade agreements around the world and get back to some normalcy and greater uniformity and openness among countries.
Let me say that I'm an ardent multilateralist. I agree that sectoral agreements, like particularly a services agreement, would be very, very helpful to our business community and our own economy. And I agree that we could move forward with gold-plated plurilateral agreements like the TPP, like the NAFTA, EU agreement. I'm all for that because it's a catalyst to get people back to the table. But keep in mind that multilateralism is not just for the mercantile benefits. It's also for the development and security benefits. And what you want is to raise the ocean floor just a bit for the poor countries like Bangladesh and Indonesia and Pakistan, who you're not going to have a regional agreement with them. You're going to try to have all of the 159 countries, the poorest in Africa, benefit by raising the floor. Yes, market access and tariffs are very important, but the Peterson Institute for International Economics has done a study of what is on the table today at Doha, and they figure that there is really quite a large benefit. It's not just tariffs, it's countries reducing their subsidies to specific industries. And the value of making this come to fruition in Bali would not be zero. We wouldn't get a huge mercantile benefit, but the poorest countries would get a great plus.
Just a quick point.
Quick point, and then
Bill,
we're going to...
just to say that, you know, we're all multilateral folks at this table today. But we're living in a world that's moved away from that, not because we want it to that to happen, but because the negotiating system in the Doha round is really broken down in that respect. I don't think, Bill, that we can have a single undertaking anymore in trade negotiations at the WTO, where one country can torpedo a negotiating process that may have been underway for 10 years. So we're going to move to it seems to me, to the modus operandi that Charlene has outlined here. And I think our challenge then as multilateralists is to find a way to multilateralize the kind of activity that Charlene talked about.
But I think we can do all three things. I think we can close out at Bali and get some value. I think we can move forward on important sectoral agreements, and we should bring to successful conclusion both the Trans-Pacific and the transatlantic arrangements. That would be a real home run.
Okay.
Amen.
We have just a couple minutes left. One giant softball for each of you, and then if we have a minute left, we'll have a question or two. Mike Froman, coming in, one sentence of advice from each of you.
Think big and move immediately to get trade promotion authority.
Be bold.
Strap on your seatbelt. Get excited about the prospects of a really dramatic improvement in the U.S. economic and security interests and in global trade. What is on the table is better than anything we've seen in the last several decades. We have the possibility to transform the global economy. You got to do it in steps, but it is in front of us, and there's nothing more important to the peace and stability of the world than seeing economic growth that is spread broadly. And we create an interdependency among these countries.
That was a run-on sentence, but okay. Charlene?
Sorry.
Cabinet secretaries are appointed by the president, but they also have a duty to push the president, and I hope Mike pushes the president.
I can't give him any advice. He's the most experienced person ever appointed. When they first came into USTR, he'll do a great job.
So I'm going to give him two pieces of advice because Mickey didn't give him any advice. First piece of advice.
But I might think of something. Go ahead.
First piece of advice is look after the USTR professional staff, and that is it's an unbelievable resource, and they need to be bolstered and looked after. It is a travesty that they are looking at furloughs in that tiny organization. Absolute travesty. This is a priority for this administration. It is unconscionable that is even a possibility. The ITEC is not funded and could easily be funded from money elsewhere. This is not a sequestration issue for an agency that size. And second piece of advice would be get a good night's sleep before you start.
And on that note, do we have any more tweets, Bill? If there, I can't see very well, but if there's one out there. Yes, sir, right there. Well,
Hi, I'm Matthew Silverman. I'm with the Future Partners Program. So my question is what you think about the proposed coming together of the USTR and the DOC and these other trade-related issues.
I take it you didn't see our letter, did you?
You can get unanimity there.
Are you serious?
It's one of the worst ideas ever.
It's worse than that.
Look,
Never.
Commerce is not worth having.
Let me give you three reasons.
no, wait a minute, wait a minute, wait a minute.
Wait a minute. Let me give you three reasons why it is a bad idea. No other trade minister will negotiate.
Define it. Just be careful defining it. It being, the thing that we're all reacting negatively to is the folding of USTR into commerce.
Absolutely, is a bad idea, a terrible idea. One is no other trade minister at the cabinet level in another country will want to negotiate with a deputy. So for protocol reasons, it's a terrible idea. Second of all, commerce has missions, anti-dumping, countervailing duty. That makes it a poor negotiator. You want a negotiator that's clean and can come in and negotiate without having baggage. And thirdly, and I think maybe most important, is the access to the president. When you see the president at cabinet meetings regularly, and you can say to him, Mr. President, I know you're going to see the Chancellor X next week. Could you raise so much? A deputy over at a distant department simply wouldn't have that access. And that's why we're also enthusiastic about Mike Froman. We think that his relationship with the president will make a difference, and he's a good economist.
But there's also a danger in even talking about the issue, because it's not going to pass the Congress. You're going to divert the conversation from some positive opportunities to a negative, and that's not real bright.
And fourth, the USTR has got to be one of the most highly respected entities in the entire U.S. government, or for that matter, any government anywhere. And why would you want to change that?
Is that clear enough for you? One more over here. Yes.
Thank you. I'm Alex Lawson from Inside U.S. Trade. Any of the formers can tackle this. I was just wondering, there's been sort of an increased clamoring for currency provisions in the TPP. It's never been in a trade agreement before, as you all know. I just want to know if you think that is a valuable use of the negotiators' time, how ambitious you think they can get, and if it ends up being in there in some form, what has changed in the landscape, since any of you were in office and it was never in a trade agreement before. So just currency in general, I guess.
Don't touch it. It is way beyond anything that you can rationally consider as a part of the negotiations we're talking about now. It is a totally different need, or animal, maybe that's the right word. There's too much going on, and we don't have anything close to the political or the financial resources to deal with that in an effective fashion. It'll divert you totally from the issues that you can deal with. Be a mistake.
Okay.
I agree.
Thank you. I think that, Bill, I can't see you. That's about right. Please, I think an extraordinary discussion.
You're the smartest person on this whole thing.
And an extraordinary moderator.
Thank you. We'll turn it back over to Mr. Maroney. Tell us what to do.
Tell us what to do.
Thank you very, very much. It's a rare occasion when we get to have 6 former USTRs together and hear their wisdom. So thank you again.